and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up in the programme today, President Trump's Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the President's son-in-law Jared Kushner arrive in Moscow for talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. We ask, can those two men deliver? And what happens if they leave empty-handed? Plus, Pope Leo XIV wraps up his visit to Lebanon, bringing a message of peace and religious coexistence. We ask, what sort of a difference did the pontiff's visit make? Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the war in Ukraine, where efforts to end the nearly 4-year-long conflict continue. The US Envoy Steve Witkoff is meeting the Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow, and questions remain over how a peace deal might be reached. Well, President Trump says he's optimistic about a deal, whilst the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the talks have been constructive up until now, but that tough issues remain. Well, this follows 2 days of talks in Florida between US and Ukrainian officials on a peace plan, the first draft of which was seen as being favourable to Russia. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Robert Fox, who is the defence editor of the London Evening Standard. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Fox. Always a pleasure having you on the programme. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner meeting President Putin in Moscow today. Are you hopeful their dialogue is going to achieve anything?
It's very difficult. It's very opaque because of what Putin has been saying in the last 24, 48 hours, which is to say that there's going to be no announcement. He's trying to keep quiet, and I think it's very much part of the Putin strategy and tactics. Say little, get them to make all the running. They made some rather extraordinary statements of late that they're winning the overwhelming victory in Pokrovsk, but there's no satellite confirmation of that yet. Putin is pushing for victory. I don't think there's anything that these two gentlemen, namely Kushner, despite being the president's son-in-law, or Witkoff, can actually deliver to him. And in fact, Witkoff, who's been doing a lot of the talking up to now, is rather a wasted asset.
Indeed, and we assume they're going to be bringing with them a document that may or may not be loosely based or closely based on the 28-point draft that emerged about 12 days ago. But we're told that it's changed a lot since then, although nothing has been made public. I mean, do you think a revised version of that, knowing how intransigent the Russians can be, knowing their red lines, do you think that document's going to be at all acceptable to Moscow?
I don't think so, unless they want to manipulate it for one particular thing within the Ukraine theatre, namely an operational pause, a ceasefire for a matter of weeks so they can regroup with their forces on the ground, possibly a matter of months so they can reorganize. And the Russian order of battle is in desperate need of this for what they see as a long confrontation with NATO, its proxies and allies, among which they have to include Ukraine now.
Yeah, and you mentioned Pokrovsk, and indeed that news has not yet been confirmed. But how strategic a town is that? Why would that be regarded? I mean, it was a town of 60,000 people before the war, presumably a lot smaller now. But is there anything about that town and its position that would make it a significant victory?
Well, the town has become significant in 1,000 cliches. In the commentariat, particularly on social media. We've read that it is strategic, that it is a hub, that it can open the way to the Dnipro river system, can open the way for the final advance on Kiev. I just advise everybody watching this interview just to be utterly skeptical about everything they're being told, all about the battlefield, but above all about Pokrovsk at the moment.
And in terms of the announcement in that regard, I mean, it's not a coincidence, is it, that this was announced as that US delegation was probably sort of in the air mid-flight on their way to Moscow to come and meet President Putin. I mean, that's part of the show, isn't it?
Exactly. And what we have to do is verification, is what the ground truth is. And it's very, very difficult to get at because the battle changes for places like Pokrovsk in that you are fighting your fibula. It's called fighting in built-up areas where The drone is no longer king. It's significant, but it's important, but you can conceal. This is the lesson of really intense fighting above the ground, immediately above the ground and underground in big, terrible urban battles like Stalingrad in 42, 43, and what the Russians experienced in the two Chechen wars, particularly in Grozny, where rubble proved to be a great defense. And why eyes in the skies don't count so much, and they do count still, but so much as they did before, is because it's line of sight firing, it's short range, rockets, direct fire systems, hide and seek, shoot and scoot. And this is a very different game. And the game, quite clearly, from the verification or attempts at verification by independent satellite monitoring, the Institute for the Study of War, they say we cannot verify that the Russians are in full control of Pokrovsk and its neighboring villages and settlements. They've been taking villages, that is absolutely clear. But whether they have the means now to build a lodgement, in other words, to concentrate a lot of forces that would have to have armor, copious artillery, a lot of close air support to be able to push on. I think that's where we have to have the gravest doubt. So it could be a victory, but it may be a victory that doesn't even deliver the whole of the north of Donetsk to the Russians. And it's something that they would have to show that they could build on, about which there is a lot of doubt at the moment. And remember, Putin wanted victory by Christmas, whether it's the Catholic Christmas on the 25th of December, or in the current general calendar, it's the Orthodox Christmas by the beginning of January. It's not clear that he can get that thing. He's trying desperately to advertise the word that I have won, I have a big victory, therefore we have to do a deal. He certainly hasn't conquered the whole of Ukraine. He certainly hasn't occupied Kiev. He certainly hasn't exercised regime change.
Yeah, and here we are in the beginning of December talking about the battlefield. And I have a feeling that in previous years, at about this time of year, things have tended to be quieter on the battlefield because of the weather, and people get frozen into their positions. Is something different this year, or is it the same as in other years, the same sort of level of battlefield manoeuvres and activity, would you say?
I don't think any year is the same. I mean, that we have to say that because there's this tremendous leapfrogging effect of war, offensive weapon and counter weapon. And first, about a few days ago, a matter of only less than a week or a couple of weeks, we were hearing, for instance, an august organization like The Economist, that of course Russia has got the advantage now because it's got jet-propelled glide bombs and jet-propelled Shahed drones. But we're beginning to read, or discovered now, that the Ukrainians have developed countermeasures to that. Oh, that they're having trouble with the F-16 fleet. Yes, they're pretty exhausted. I mean, in terms of battle tempo, they have exceeded any expectation. But look, we're now getting the Mirage fighter bombers, the French, which are an interim stop to a long-term purchase, we understand, of Rafale, and they're going to get Gripen towards the end of 26. Very effective close defense, close attack aircraft, absolutely ideally suited to the Ukraine battlescape. They're going to come in by summer. So it ain't all over until it's all over.
Sure, and you might be sort of partially answering my next question there, because I mean, we've been talking about how Russia controls about 19% of Ukrainian territory. Do correct me if you've got another figure. But I'm wondering whether you think President Putin and the Russian army are feeling any pressure to end the war at this particular stage, or whether they're on something of a roll in terms of clocking up gains on the battlefield. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's the thought that they want to plant in our head, that they're on a roll, that they're going to win. And that was actually Putin's rhetoric of 2 nights ago. This is what he's trying to do. But again, it's very difficult to get outside verification of that. And there are problems. But let's talk about the main proposition first. He has to do it. He can do no retreat. He can't go firm on lines and just stop now, because Putin is absolutely geared to a war economy and a war destiny. That is Russia. That's what Russia stands for. Otherwise, the whole thing, the whole Putin gambit, the whole Putin experiment will be thwarted. So you have to look at that. So are they gaining? Yes, they're gaining. They're gaining at a slightly faster rate than they were, though the gains in December are not at the same rate as they were in November. You can play these games forever. There are problems, though, that they're raising over 30,000 recruiting a month, but they're not particularly quality, and they're losing globally almost the same number. That is not a good situation to be in, and particularly where there was a graphic report by the ASW from first-hand sources that they are doing very badly on battle casualty recoveries. The medical services in the front line appear to be so much poorer for the Russians than it is for the Ukrainians. A badly wounded Ukrainian can expect to be recovered. A badly wounded Russian is quite likely to be abandoned.
Okay, and we've heard from President Putin in the last couple of hours. He appears to be giving some sort of a press briefing, which has been drip-fed in the form of wire alerts. A couple of things he said. He said Europe is on the side of war. If the Europeans want war, we're ready. And European demands are unacceptable. These are some of the highlights that I can pick out of what President Putin's been saying. A lot of focus on Europe, and he's saying this as an American delegation has arrived in Moscow. Why do you think that is? Do you think he's trying to drive a wedge between the two sides?
Between who?
Between the Europeans and the Americans.
But Trump seems to be doing that for himself. You're absolutely right. And this is what Putin very shrewdly has spotted. In the original 28 points, as it came out from the end of October going through to November, it's almost as if, and America at one point in the original 28 points wanted to be rewarded for this, paid for it, to be a referee, to manage the peace. And it was going to cast judgment by implication between the combatants, namely Russia on the one hand, Ukraine, but of course NATO. It was as if NATO was an antagonist which had nothing to do with America. Now, it's the alienation of Europe, and particularly the right-wing nationalist, sovereigntist Europe, which is the most dangerous thing that Trump appears to be doing at the moment. Here I allude to a seminal essay by the great writer and thinker Ivan Krastev in the current edition of Foreign Affairs. Because let me explain, though courted by Hegseth and above all J.D. Vance, the sovereigntist right, you can name them, Alternative for Deutschland, it's some of the nationalists, even in Poland, Hungary, Czech, and Slovakia, park them. Vox in Spain, even Meloni's Brothers of Italy, Le Pen's rally, Farage reform in Britain. What Hegseth and above all Vance, particularly in his speech to the security conference in Munich in February, seemed to say, these are our people, the other people in charge, even Kemi Badenoch, for instance, the Conservative, a natural ally, I would have thought, of the Republicans, the governments in Britain, France, Germany, are not our allies. This has not worked, because what you see is happening with AfD and the other, they're saying, no, we are for Germany, we are for Germany in our version of Europe, and we are not going to be a lapdog or a poodle to the Trump very fragmented, fractured MAGA project. So the MAGA courting by the likes of Vance, of the nationalist right in Europe, has failed utterly, because it's ended up, if you can follow my logic through to this point, it has alienated what they thought was a national ally. So alienating left, right, and center in Europe, in democratic Europe, has weakened America. This seems to be dripping through very slowly. By the way, the military establishment in America completely get this, completely understand it.
Okay, well, really appreciate you sharing that with us. And we've got to a very interesting point in the conversation, but I'm being told we're out of time. So thank you very much indeed. Robert Fox, defence editor of the London Evening Standard. Always a pleasure having you on the programme. Thank you again. Now turning our attention to the Middle East, because Pope Leo XIV has just wrapped up his three-day visit to Lebanon. That was part of his first tour outside of Italy since becoming Pope. Well, during the two-stop tour, he also visited Turkey. Well, on his final day in Lebanon, the pontiff led a mass at the site of the 2020 Beirut port explosion, where he called for peace and unity, describing Lebanon as a gift from God, but one, he said, that is overshadowed by poverty and suffering. Well, on the second day in Lebanon, the Pope visited the Our Lady of Lebanon shrine in Harissa, which is just to the north of Beirut, where he prayed for peace. The pontiff also headed to the St. Meron monastery, where he was greeted by both Christians and Muslims, delivering a message of unity and coexistence in a region still grappling with conflict. Well, during his first day in Lebanon, Pope Leo XIV was welcomed with traditional dubke dancing. This happened just outside the Babda presidential palace, just ahead of his meeting with the Lebanese President Joseph Aoun and other top officials. Let's take a quick look. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Bishop Paul Marwan Thabet, who is the eparchial bishop of the Maronite Catholics in Canada. He joined us, in fact, from Beirut. Your Excellency, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Al Arabiya English.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for hosting me today.
Thank you. We saw some pictures of crowds gathering along the roads to welcome the Pope and then ultimately to say goodbye to the Pope when he left.
Yes.
How successful do you think this visit was by the Pope overall?
It is very obvious that the visit of Pope Leo XIV is very successful. The fact is, on all sides of the roads, wherever he visited in the last 2-3 days, hundreds of people were gathered. The schedule of the visit of the Pope, the places he visited have their indication, starting, first of all, by visiting the presidential palace. And this marked the visit of a head of a state, that's the state of the Vatican, to the head of the state of Lebanon. But at the presidential palace, the Pope addressed the diplomatic corps and the official politicians of Lebanon. And he insisted on two matters in his address. First of all, on the common good. And the second is working together toward peace in Lebanon and in the region in the Middle East. Beside that, the next day, the Pope met all the religious leaders and the monks and the nuns and the priests in Lebanon and the region. And one of the strong messages he sent to this crowd is to remain good witnesses to the presence of the Church and to the presence of the love of Christ and charity in a hostile region and in the world, and the importance of being good witnesses of Christianity in the Muslim world is to live by our brother Muslims and continue to serve them in any way we can. In the evening yesterday, he met with the youth. And as I said, he spoke to them in their own language, in Arabic, addressed them on many instances. And two important messages he gave them. First of all, to remain attached to the ground of Lebanon, don't leave. don't get into the diaspora, and the second, that to be artisans of peace and to hold peace and be close to their neighbors. Also, yesterday there was a meeting for all the leaders of the religious communities in the country. As you may know, Lebanon has 18 different confessions. And today in the Big Mass, there was about 120, 130,000. The Pope told the Lebanese to stay close to each other and to indeed be partisan of peace. And he promised as well to do his best to help avoid and move Lebanon away from a strict war and work toward peace in Lebanon and in the region.
Okay, well, I was going to...
that with that, I gave you a general overview of the visit of the Pope.
Absolutely. Lots of colour in the picture that you painted there. Yeah. I would just ask you very quickly... go ahead.
I would like to mention one important thing, or two important things in the visit of the Pope. The first one is that visiting Lebanon is a part of the first apostolic visit of Pope Leo XIV, Turkey and Lebanon. The second, and it's to bring to the light the role of the patriarchates of Antioch and Constantinople as being the two key patriarchates that worked very hard during the establishment of Christianity in the church 2,000 years ago. And the second point is to pinpoint and put the light on the role of Lebanon in being a model of conviviality, of dialogue between the different religious groups and different ethnic groups and different civilizations, Christianity and Islam. And Lebanon as being a crossroad of dialogue between Christianity and Islam and between the East and the West. As John Paul II said, Lebanon is not a country, it's more than a country. It's a message for the West as it is for the East.
Okay, well, thank you very much for setting the scene for us. I want to ask you for some more details, because you said the Pope, who is, by the way, for the benefit of our viewers, he's a new Pope and he's an American national, and it was widely expected he would speak English quite a lot during this visit, as opposed to Italian, which is what popes usually speak. But you say he spoke Arabic as well. What did he say?
Look, in most of the gatherings we had, the Pope spoke French. Yesterday, addressing the religious leaders and the monks and the nuns, he spoke in French. Addressing the youth, in a part he spoke in French, then he addressed them in a word in English. Today, during the Mass, he did the Mass in French and the address in French. And at the end of the Mass, when he sent a strong message about Lebanon, he did it in English. So basically, he went in respect to the second important language in Lebanon, that's the French. For the Arabic, it was more a cordial address, a getting closer address, telling the people that he feels with them. He wanted to win their hearts and be part of their culture. And this is when he addressed them, in key important salutes, I would say, in Arabic. So it was mostly saluting in Arabic more than the address itself.
Give me an example, Your Excellency, of a couple of the salutes he gave.
In Arabic, I would say, Assalamu ma'akum. And then, the people react to that. During the Mass, he said, Assalamu li jami'ikum, peace be with you all. So on every corner, when he used to exhort them with a salute in Arabic, you can tell how the crowd was really, jumping to answer him and to shout and cry, Viva el Papa, Viva el Papa. It means Vive the Pope, Vive the Pope. So it was very nice. It was basically like an electric vibe in the crowd that brought them to really cry, Viva el Papa, Viva el Papa. And it was this this cry and the sound was a sort of commissioning the Pope to really talk in their name on the international platforms to safeguard Lebanon and to bring peace to Lebanon and keep that peace, as the Lebanese have really had enough of the war that's going on since 1975, I would say.
Right, and you're making it sound as though he brought a lot of hope to people in Lebanon, a lot of optimism.
He definitely did.
They need it, don't they?
His last message today on the seafront of Beirut, his message was very, very strong, as he said that he's going to take it upon himself on the international platform, international political platform, to really plead for peace in Lebanon and in the region.
Your Excellency, of course, a lot of Lebanese people are not Christian, and I'm just wondering what people from other religious groups and sects, even Christians who are not Catholics, what do you think they think of the Pope? What sort of an impression did he give them of who he is, and how excited were they about his arrival?
Look, let me tell you that living in Lebanon is a door to see how Christians and Muslims live side by side. Many villages in Lebanon are mixed villages where you see Christians and Muslims are living next to each other. Many Lebanese from different religious backgrounds have businesses together, are partners in businesses, or are work in the same companies. Although the war has differentiated the Lebanese and split them into different regions, every time peace comes, the Lebanese blend together. What they see, what they think of the Pope, this is the fourth visit for a Pope to Lebanon. The first one was in 1964, Pope Paul VI. Then John Paul II, 1997. Then Benedict XVI in 2012, and now 2025, Pope Leo XIV. I need to tell you that on the exit of the airport of Beirut, as the airport sits in a dense Islamic area, you could see how Muslims and women who have their veil are on the streets with their kids screaming, Viva el Papa, Viva el Papa. Lebanese are well known to really cheer for each other. The problem of Lebanon is a political problem. It's in the politics where we have the differences. If we leave the people to go by what they feel, you would see all the Lebanese together. As a matter of fact, the Pope was very surprised to see in downtown Beirut, in the meeting, on the religious dialogue meeting, the 18 heads of the 18 confessions in Lebanon sitting in there and expressing and pleading for peace for Lebanon, and explaining to the Pope and speaking about the experiences how Christians and Muslims live together. The Pope was very surprised with that.
Yeah, Your Excellency, I wanted to ask you about the interfaith dialogue that took place, because there were meetings, weren't there? And you've mentioned this with Sunni, Shia, Druze communities. I want to ask you, what's the value, do you think, of that kind of interfaith exchange and dialogue?
Look, let me tell you something. No one is trying to bring the other in his camp. Definitely, but at least be able to find areas of common values. And let's remember that the Christians and Muslims have in common many texts that come from the Old Testament, and all of us recognize that. So basically, the work, the dialogue that is taking place is the dialogue of life, which means that I need to respect the other where he is. The other has to respect me or is invited to respect me where I am. And that in the same country, we can exist together, we can live together, we can build a good society together. We can be who we are without trying to push the other to come in my camp or go in his camp, and yet be able to establish a country. Lebanon was like that since I would say the 17th, 18th century. The Christian and Muslim and Jews were living together. Every time there was a problem, it was the problem of the others on our territory. And as a matter of fact, the problem of Lebanon today is not the problem of the Lebanese. It's the situation of the Palestinians that were expelled out of their country. They need to find a place for them. They thought Lebanon could be the best place. Then the Lebanese fought the war for that. Then Lebanon received 2 million Syrians from our brother Syrians from different denominations. In a country of 4 million people, we still have 2 million refugees, not to speak of many refugees that came from Iraq, from Egypt, from Sudan, from different countries. So basically, the problem of Lebanon is not the problem of the Lebanese. Yes, I need to acknowledge that parts of the Lebanese have gotten involved into it, and especially where we had parts of Lebanon, of the Lebanese population, to go and abide by orders of different countries around us. Some of the Lebanese went with the Syrian regime, so they took orders from the Syrian regime and played to be able to find the space for them in the country and play a role. Other, like Hezbollah, were very close to the Iranian regime and became part of a military hand for the Iranian regime. And so we have problem with some of the Lebanese who are not fully for Lebanon, but I would say most of the Lebanese, on a general basis, 80%, 90% of the Lebanese want peace, want to live together in a beautiful space of conviviality. I'm hoping that we can arrive one day to this fact. The problematic in the area that Lebanon has is that we have, Israel on the border of Lebanon, and Israel want to make peace with all the countries, the Arab countries, to make peace with the Arab countries, but they cannot make peace while taking pieces of the country, of the other countries. So now there is talks about that, and we are hoping that the entire area will go now into a new trend where all countries in the region can sit down on the same level with the same capacities without one country pushing down the throat of other countries, their policies and their dynamics, and be able to come up with some sort of a peace so we can wave away, especially from Lebanon, a big war and a full destruction of the country.
Right, and of course there has been ongoing violence between Israel and Hezbollah during the course of several years, but in particular in the last year, even during the Pope's visit.
This choice of the war with Israel is not the choice of all the Lebanese, nor it is the choice of the Lebanese government.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to bring to the picture.
Absolutely. And I'm just wondering, how much did the Pope mention the situation with regards to Israel? Did he mention Israel at all?
At least in the meetings where I am, and I've been to most of the meetings, he did not mention Israel, but he insinuated in some way the importance to see as well Israel moving one step forward toward being a partisan of peace.
One of the people that the Pope met was Mohammed Rad, who is one of Hezbollah's most senior members of parliament. I gather they met during the visit to the presidential palace. How do you think Hezbollah views the Pope and viewed this whole papal visit?
Look, let me tell you. In 2012, I was myself the coordinator of the visit of Pope Benedict XVI. And as the Pope exited the airport, thousands of our brothers and sisters, the Shiite, and many of them were from members or partisans of Hezbollah, were on the streets. Asked by Hezbollah themselves, because these people took order from Hezbollah to go out and to greet the Pope. Never in the history of Lebanon, the Hezbollah were against the Pope or against the Christians, and as such. However, we must admit that they have their ideology, they have their plans, they have their way of looking at things. And on some of these issues, many Lebanese are not happy with it. So mobilizing the people and living with the Christians is one thing, and implementing policies or taking order from Iran is a totally different thing. But they've never been against the church or being in proximity with the Christians. As a matter of fact, we have one or two Lebanese political parties who are in the majority Christians are allies with Hezbollah. And they allied in political action, in parliament, in voting for parliamentarians. So this is very clear, very obvious. Now, is everybody in accordance with that or happy with that? Some are yes, some others are no.
Well, the United States is definitely not happy with this, and they've been calling on Lebanon's leaders to disarm Hezbollah, a very difficult task, I know. Do you think the Pope, being an American and being the first American Pope...
Would you allow me to say that now, at this stage, yes, also these Christian political parties have asked Hezbollah to really disarm and give to the Lebanese army the authority and the responsibility to safeguard Lebanon and to protect Lebanon, and give the Lebanese army all the trust they need in order to protect the country and be the only military umbrella in the country. So yes, definitely, this has been said with all respect to the members of Hezbollah, with all respect to the alliances that are there, but definitely all Lebanese now, but Hezbollah, want that the Lebanese army would be in charge of protecting the country and have exclusivity of the power of the military fire.
Right, and of course the demands are coming from President Trump in Washington that Hezbollah disarm. And my question to you is, given that Pope Leo is an American, first and foremost, I'm wondering whether he can perhaps help in any way. Could he serve as an interlocutor between the Lebanese government and Washington in bringing about that goal, managing the expectations on both sides?
My information tells me that the diplomacy of the Vatican is at proximity with the diplomacy of the United States. All true. So having Pope Leo XIV as the head of the Vatican and the Vatican diplomacy, definitely it will help, since he knows the mentality and he knows the way, and he has canals to be able to talk to the White House. But we need to be careful and to pinpoint that the Vatican, since the beginning of the war in Lebanon, has put in and all forward a very distinct and fine diplomacy where Lebanon is being concerned. Definitely the Pope, and that's my feeling, especially when I saw him at the end of the Mass, standing there on the top of the altar waving, and you have that feel that it's like he's leaving, but he has left a piece of him in Lebanon from what he has seen. That definitely he's gonna push himself and more of the Vatican diplomacy to work in favor of the peace in Lebanon, for Lebanon, and in the region, and for the region. Let's remember that Christians are not only present in Lebanon and are leaving Lebanon. Also, we are seeing what's happening in Syria, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Egypt, all over the Middle East. And it's in the interest of the Arabs and the Muslim countries to protect the Christians and protect Christianity in this part of the world. And definitely the Vatican diplomacy is going to be exhorted by Pope Leo XIV to put more energy into this.
And just to bring our conversation to a conclusion, do you think the Pope liked Lebanon? Do you think he enjoyed his visit?
I need to tell you that very few would come to Lebanon and do not love Lebanon. I would start by diplomatic corps. You know that many diplomats that have served their countries and countries members of the G8, I would say, or the G12, after their retirement have come back, bought homes or lands in Lebanon and built their homes, and they live in Lebanon, or they live in their original country in Lebanon. It is very difficult to come to Lebanon and don't love the country and the people. So as I mentioned it, I repeat in saying that after all the clergy that helped the Pope on the altar and exited the altar, including the Vatican delegation, being Cardinal Parolin, the head of the state, and the other cardinals and bishops that were with him, and the priest, the Pope stood there in front of the altar and waved and waved. And the crowds were shouting "Viva el Papa, Viva el Papa," and a good observer could tell that the Pope has left a piece of him in Lebanon.
Okay, and just what do you think is going to stand out as being the highlight of the whole trip? What memory do you think you will endure from this visit?
First of all, the hospitality. Second. I guess the beauty of the country. Third, to which extent Lebanese are together regardless of the political problems that they have between each other, and the importance of the Christian presence in this country, and the model of Lebanon in terms of dialogue of life that need to be protected in a time where there is no more repair in the world, there is no more compasses in the world. Lebanon needs to be protected as a model in this regard.
Okay, Your Excellency, thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate you speaking to Arabiya English. Bishop Paul Marwan Thabit, the Eparchial Bishop of Maronite Catholics in Canada. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Well, to tell us more, I'm joined here in the studio by Makram Rabah, who is an assistant professor of history at the American University of Beirut. Professor Rabah, thank you very much for coming to see us again.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you with us. What do you think this visit by Pope Leo XIV meant to the Lebanese people?
Well, it's yet one more affirmation to the Lebanese that they actually matter. A small country such as Lebanon has been visited by 4 popes, and this is not something to take lightly. And this is not because there's Christians in the country. Definitely, he did come to see his parish, so to speak, but he is in Lebanon because of the diversity, because of the legacy, and because of the history that we have. But basically, I believe that his visit is about the future, not our past. He's been clear, his brand, the branding of this visit is "Blessed are the peacemakers." And this is the first thing he uttered when he gave his speech from the presidential palace. Unfortunately, the political establishment hasn't acted on this. Yes, they do mention this. They do mention that they are willing to engage in peace talks. But peace requires politics, not religious metaphors like our president did. What happened actually is the Pope was acting as a politician, whereas the political establishment are trying to avoid the inevitable, which is basically we have to live in peace. We've tried war, and it doesn't suit us. And if you want to actually defeat, quote unquote, the Israelis, you have to have a sustainable state. As is, and because of Hezbollah, and because of the corruption and the system itself, we have gotten to a point where we need someone like Pope Leo to remind us of what's important, which is basically transitioning from a vengeful mindset into a mindset that embraces peace and stability.
Professor, you're making it sound like this is a bit of a missed opportunity by Lebanon's political class. Here you have an American Pope who clearly, obviously, speaks English as well as French, and he used a few words of Arabic as well, we're told during the visit, who's got the ear of President Trump. And there he is in Lebanon talking to all the leaders, all the different religious leaders, almost offering to help. And he could help, couldn't he?
Definitely he could. And I think everyone wants to help Lebanon, but the Lebanese political establishment doesn't want to help itself. You can actually hit the lottery if you go and you buy the ticket. So this is what the international community and, more important, the Gulf states have been telling Lebanon. We are willing to bankroll any renaissance, any rebuilding process, as long as you disarm Hezbollah. And this is something, I actually had an article out in Arabic that says this is a culture of missed opportunities. It's like having the perfect opportunity and you throw it in the garbage just because you're not willing to change and you're not willing to read the region around you. Yes, Pope Leo has the ear of Trump, he has the ear of J.D. Vance as well as Marco Rubio. But at the end of the day, he is the Pope. He speaks on behalf of Christianity in a way. And his visit was yet another reminder that we need to act. The Pope visits you as a way of rewarding you for success, or actually trying to warn you that you need to clean up your act. And this is, I think, his visit is not to celebrate Lebanon, but rather to tell them that the idea of Lebanon is at risk. You need to act and act now.
Right, so a little bit of a warning in what he was saying.
Indeed it is. Because he did address the Lebanese, and he believes that the Lebanese, particularly the young generation, including those who parrot the words of Hezbollah, they want peace. But his warning and his demands were to the political establishment and the policymakers, which haven't been acting like policymakers since ever.
So there are these big demands that have been made by Washington on the newish leadership in Beirut. There is now a president, there is a prime minister, everything sort of is functioning, everything's in place, you'd have thought.
If you want to use the word functioning.
Okay, yeah. maybe the word functioning is stretching a little bit. But in terms of those demands by Washington, disarm Hezbollah, and I heard you use it then, I mean, much easier said than done. Is this mission impossible?
Not really. You're not actually asking the Lebanese army to actually go in and take the physical arms of Hezbollah. But what is really a catastrophe and a tragedy is for the Lebanese president, who's a former commander of the Lebanese army, to actually parrot the rhetoric of Hezbollah. This is actually the real tragedy which we're undergoing. More importantly, we need to transition to the fact that the Constitution does not give the right to any militia to operate outside the framework of the state. More importantly, the Americans are not asking for the impossible. They're asking you to act like a sovereign state by stopping money laundering, by stopping drug operations. A couple of weeks ago, the Saudis gave us a kind of thumbs up that we are no longer a narco state. I actually felt insulted that we were a narco state to begin with. It's not the fault of the Saudis, it's not the fault of the Americans, it's the fault of the narco states that were operating within the Hezbollah system, as well as the former Assad regime. So in a way, one has to address the real problem in the room. The real problem in the room that Hezbollah is part and parcel of the Lebanese political establishment, but it acts as if it's outside it. And this is where the role of the president is, to confront them politically and to rebuild the country bit by bit. And it requires transparency, fighting corruption, and in a way, acknowledging that what made Hezbollah normal is the fact that we were willing to deal with them when they were fighting in Yemen, when they were fighting in Syria, and when they were spreading terror on behalf of the Lebanese.
Pope Leo obviously met a lot of Lebanon's political leaders, religious leaders. He even met, one of the people present at his presidential palace address was a senior politician from Hezbollah, Mohammed Rad. Do you think the message got across? Do you think that message was communicated in such a way it was received, understood, and that Lebanon will now take some of these measures that the United States wants it to take?
Hezbollah is willing to play along, and in a way, I don't want to call them hypocrites, but they have done so a number of times. Ironically, they were their Boy Scouts were receiving Pope Leo. They were waving flags and stuff. But at the end of the day, they stand in stark opposition to the idea of the Christian church, of love, about forgiveness, about peace. So whatever Muhammad Ra'ad and Hezbollah say on TV, on the ground they do differently. They believe that ultimately they can throw the Jews into the sea. And the main problem is that it's not really a problem about interfaith dialogue. The Lebanese don't have a religious problem with the Jewish state. We have a political problem that can be resolved either through truth, without actually continuing the war, or transitioning into a kind of peace. Many people have tried peace, and I think Egypt and Jordan are in much better position than they were back in the 60s and the 70s.
But do you see President Aoun taking on board the messages that Pope Leo gave, that echoed really in a way what the Trump administration is saying? Is he going to do something about this?
The way that he and his wife were acting, they were very happy, and they have the right to, because they were receiving the head of the Catholic Church. But they need to act according to the demands of them. They are religious Christians, and they should listen to the father of the church. I hope that I'm wrong, but the president, since he took office, his speech gave us a lot of expectations, but he has fell short in a number of ways. Every time the Lebanese state have been challenged, Joseph Aoun finds a way to justify why Hezbollah continues to have arms. I believe I would invite him to prove me wrong and to prove those people who are critical. But at the same time, when we critique Joseph Aoun, we are critiquing him because we want him to succeed, not to fail. That's a major difference between what we're trying, the pro-sovereign movement wants a normal Lebanon, which we can enjoy, where the Pope can come back and visit and see that his words and his missionary activity actually were successful.
Right, but you don't sound very optimistic that that's going to happen.
Well, I am optimistic because the region around us is changing, and because the Iranian axis has proved to be toxic on itself and on the people of Iran and the people of Lebanon. So I think the change would come, but this Lebanese house will never ever be well until we actually clean up our act. No one could do this on our behalf. And this is where I believe that the Lebanese and the young generation down the line are willing to do this, whereas the political establishment at the moment has failed miserably.
There have been Israeli attacks continuing on Lebanese soil in recent days. I'm just wondering, what did we hear from the Pope? He didn't actually mention Israel specifically, did he? I'm just wondering what message came across on that front.
He doesn't go into the weeds. The Pope doesn't really talk about, doesn't go into too much baseball, to speak. He speaks about general directions. But at the same time, we know for a fact that the Israelis will not stop their breach of Lebanese sovereignty unless Lebanese sovereignty is established. I know it's a kind of a paradox, but the 1701 plus clearly says that if the Lebanese army does not police Lebanon, the Americans have given this go-ahead to Israel to police its borders. And what's there happening with the buffer zones and with the occupation of these key points in Lebanon is just to embarrass the Lebanese state. The Lebanese state says that we cannot hold the south as long as there's occupation. But it's basically the chicken or the egg scenario here.
Right.
No one is willing to accept this.
Right, because the more Israel strikes southern Lebanon as well, the more of a raison d'etre that Hezbollah has, and the louder their rallying cry can be.
But
they'll say, look why you need us.
But also at the same time, no one believes that this is a war between Lebanon and Israel. This is a war brought about by Iran and by Hassan Nasrallah, who decided to open this so-called front in support of Gaza. We saw that nothing came out of it except his own death and the death of his leadership. I believe at the end of the day, the Lebanese have been reminded over and over again that they can't call themselves presidents and prime ministers if there's no sovereignty involved. Sovereignty has to do with the currency, has to do with the economy, has to do with education, has to do with preventing a militia to take over public space. And all of this is important. Independent judiciary, all of these are important as this arming Hezbollah.
How do you think the Trump administration is going to react if, here we are, 9 months, 10 months into President Trump's presidency, He's sent multiple delegations to Lebanon to get them to act and to get them to resolve some of these historical issues. If they don't deliver, how do you see him responding to that?
Well, as we speak, Deputy US Envoy Morgan Ortega is in Israel, and she's coming to Lebanon and is going to Syria. I believe that they will take it up a bit, meaning that they will go for sanctions, and I think smart sanctions do work. They're not willing to give up on Lebanon, because giving up on Lebanon will be counterproductive for US interests. We have a number of delegations coming, particularly those that have to do with US Treasury and counterterrorism, with also Dr. Gorka, who visited the president. They told him, if you don't know how money is coming in, we will show you. So they're willing to work with the Lebanese government and with the Lebanese army if they're willing to act like a Lebanese army. At the end of the day, we got $200 million from the US, not to turn around and call the Israelis enemies. They are enemies because we have Hezbollah shooting across the border. Even if they are enemies, we have to get to a point where we can actually sit down and have a civilized conversation, how to, at the end of the day, stop hostilities and get rid of an Iranian-sponsored militia operating out of Lebanon.
We've talked all about Israel-Hezbollah issues. There are other issues facing Lebanon, some of them obviously related. Lebanon's a fragile country. 1 million Syrian and Palestinian refugees still remain in the country. Correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers. That economic crisis that really began in about 2019, well, that's when it started to show its face in a dramatic way. Have things improved on other fronts? Are things getting better in Lebanon?
Well, it is because the private sector is very resilient and it was able to bounce back. But the main problem, what is dragging Lebanon back, is the public sector. And here I'm not saying that we need to slash the public sector, but rather to modernize it, to pass laws. And we are facing upcoming parliamentary elections, which the political establishment is trying to postpone. I always remind the Lebanese that during the peak of the war between Hezbollah and Israel, the Israelis had municipal elections. This is an indication that there are stuff that should not be paused or postponed, particularly reforms. The international community, the IMF, the World Bank has said that we are willing to help you, but you need to reform and have structural changes. And I think these reforms, we don't really need money, but it's like a 12-step program for an addict. The Lebanese have been addicted to the idea that they're too big to fail, and the international community, and particularly the Gulf, will always be a safety net. When you opened up your country to Iran and to turn the whole country into a narco state and a money laundering machine, you paid for it with the collapse of your... Not to mention that the system that was operating was founded by the great Rafiq al-Hariri, who was killed back in 2005 by Iran and by Hezbollah. We are just paying the price of what we did not really confront back when it happened.
We're about to hit the one-year anniversary of the fall of Bashar al-Assad in neighbouring Syria, and I'm wondering whether, on reflection, looking back at these 12 months, whether a more stable Syria and a government that's in place that is supported by the United States and by other regional powers, whether that's helped improve Lebanon's lot as well.
Definitely it did, because it toned down a lot of the xenophobia, because now many of these people are willing to go back home, but still it is a job of the Lebanese state to jumpstart the mechanism process. There's a lot of stuff we need to give. We need to give birth certificates to many of these refugees who were born in Lebanon to be able to go back home. And I believe we should be able to have a kind of normalized relationships with the Sharia government, because at the end of the day, Sharia will need Lebanon to rebuild Syria, and we need Syria to go back into the international orbit, so to speak. Yes, definitely not having a criminal like Bashar al-Assad in Syria helping Iran move their weapons and to breach Lebanon's sovereignty is important, but it won't change much unless the Lebanese take the extra step.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, going back to talking specifically about the Pontiff's visit, this was his first overseas tour as head of the Catholic Church. His first stop was obviously Turkey. Overall, how successful would you say this visit was? And is there one highlight that you think will perhaps be etched into your memory from it?
Well, for me, him delivering his sermon from the Beirut port where we had the famous port explosion, is a very important message to the international community and to the Lebanese that justice is important, especially that the families of the victims of the port explosion were there. He did what a pope would do by visiting these monasteries, which go back ages and centuries. Yet his political messaging was important. I believe that he was on point in everything he said when it came to politics and for the future of Lebanon. Whereas the political establishment and the president is caught up in the history and the golden days of Lebanon. We want to live in the future, not in the past. All of us have a golden past, but in the last 2 decades, we have fell behind. We need to catch up to what's happening around us, and we need to be very vigilant that everyone wants to help us. And if we don't study up, if we're too lazy, they will just drop us from the course, and that's very dangerous.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Makram Rabah, thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Matthew Breiser, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. He joins us now from Istanbul. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Matthew. We heard the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio describing the talks in Florida at the weekend as being productive, but he said that tough issues still need to be resolved. I mean, what sorts of issues do you think he might be talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's the key question. And we don't know what the outcome was of the talks because there hasn't been any detail. The tough issue, I mean, there are a couple of really, really tough ones, which reflect the fact that while the United States has been negotiating with Ukraine and with European allies, Russia hasn't negotiated at all. Russia's original demands remain what they had been from the very beginning, which is that Ukraine's government be denazified, whatever the heck that means. It means regime change, that Ukraine's military has serious limits placed on it, and that Ukraine agrees to Russia gaining and occupying all of the Donbas region, even the areas that Russia does not currently occupy and has been unable to capture through its military actions since February 2022. Now, to give up territory requires a change in the Ukrainian constitution from President Zelensky's perspective. And so that issue of territory is one that the Ukrainian delegation has previously said can only be settled at the level of the presidents.
Okay, and what we know is going to happen this week is that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are going to go to Moscow. They're going to hold talks, we're told, with President Putin. Do you think those two men have got the right skill sets to deliver, or would you be more comfortable seeing seasoned diplomats taking on this kind of work?
Well, as an old Russian hand, former professional diplomat, maybe I'm biased, but Russians are unbelievably skillful negotiators. They game everything out months, even years in advance, step by step. That's why they haven't moderated their goals at all. Same goals they've had now for nearly 4 years. So you have to be completely in tune with the history of the negotiations, the history also of Russia's security aspirations in Europe, their fears and their aggressive goals, and the Russian psychology. And with all due respect to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, they have none of that experience. Jared Kushner's a very smart guy. He seemed to perform pretty well on some of the Middle Eastern negotiations, especially involving the Abraham Accords. But Witkoff has been miserable, and he's shown absolutely no understanding of how Russia negotiates. He's been outplayed, and that initial 28-point plan that he brought from Moscow was clearly written by the Russians, or at least 80% of it was. So that's a very long-winded, yes, I think these guys are not equipped to do the job.
Right, and this will be Witkoff's 6th face-to-face meeting with President Putin. And a lot of people in Europe are a bit worried about that. They think it's a bit cozy. Does it ring an alarm bell for you?
It does. So I negotiated with the Russians in the middle of one war, Russia's invasion of Georgia, and all the time leading up to it, and all the time after it. And I've gone through how they try to ingratiate themselves to a mediator, like I was at the time. All sorts of false flattery and warmth, and it's all to manipulate you, to soften you, to try to see things their way. And I've seen many of my colleagues succumb to it at all. And that is what is happening to Witkoff. He clearly is cheerleading for Russia. That's why that call was, the call that was the transcript that Bloomberg uncovered, why he made the call to Yuri Ushakov, who's President Putin's top foreign policy aide. He was coaching Putin via Ushakov on how to get into Trump's good graces. A mediator must never do that. The mediator has to remember that he or she are playing for their home team, in this case, the United States, not for Russia. And an agreement with Russia, just for the sake of an agreement, especially one that is going to undermine not only Ukraine's security, but Europe's security as well, is a disaster. So, yeah, he's being really played by the Russians, Witkoff.
Right, and I think some people in Washington are starting to get a bit worried about this, including in the Republican Party. Senator Mitch McConnell saying America isn't a neutral arbiter and we shouldn't act like one. That's what he had to say. And the Representative Mike Turner of Ohio, another Republican, said that Russia should be treated as a skeptical adversary. He said, you can't be America first and pro-Russian because Russia is a self-declared adversary of the United States. I mean, is this starting to look quite risky for President Trump? And what happens if those two men come back from Moscow empty-handed?
It's hugely risky, and they're all going to look naive. Trump can probably, blow through it for a while. I've heard a lot of rumors that Witkoff is on his way out, that Marco Rubio was furious, Secretary of State Rubio was furious when Witkoff produced that 28-point plan that he co-wrote with the Russians. So I think Trump, if he needs to, he'll just fire them. But the thing we all need to keep in mind is that Russia considers itself to be at war with us in the West. I mean, that's not hyperbole. They are conducting hybrid warfare against us. And if you look at the Russian national security strategy, it says its primary, not adversary, enemy is the United States and its European allies. So they're fighting a war. And Trump's mediators think they're going to get a ceasefire and win the Nobel Peace Prize. And all it's going to do is to buy time for Russia to recover from this war and rearm and get ready to go at it again in a few years.
Right. And when we see Europe and the United States looking like other than close allies, singing from the same song sheet and in lockstep with each other, sharing the same positions, I mean, that must just be music to the ears of people like Sergei Lavrov and President Putin.
Tom, that's a great insight, and I meant to raise this point a couple of minutes ago. Yes. So one of the unacceptable points that most news stories have glossed over in those original 28 points was exactly this, that the United States, this is what Russia proposed and Witkoff accepted, the United States will serve as a mediator between Europe, meaning the U.S.'s NATO allies, and Russia. So that's a naked attempt by Russia to pull the U.S. out of NATO and make NATO somehow a competitor with the United States, when in reality, the United States is the great protector and most significant ally of the whole NATO alliance.
Right. So, I mean, and again, this undermining of trust between the two sides, I mean, that could have consequences, couldn't it, long after the event and beyond Ukraine, next time there's a conflict that involves the United States and its European allies. I mean, if the trust isn't there, I mean, doesn't that have consequences potentially for the United States later on down the line?
For everybody. I mean, it could lead to a huge new war. I don't want to use the phrase world war, but it could lead to something enormous. Yes. So the whole premise of deterrence, of deterring Russia from using military force, is the understanding that any attempt to do so will be self-destructive, because this alliance of the United States and Europe and Canada is so strong. It's the strongest political military alliance in human history, and therefore the most successful one. So for decades, the Russian side has tried to put a wedge between the United States and its European allies to weaken NATO. And if I may, one more point that terrifies me is look at how Russia handled the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. A bunch of little green men, as they were called, entered Crimea, entered Donbass. President Putin said, no, those aren't our guys, until they controlled some, in some cases, minor territory. Then he said, those are our guys. Okay, Ukraine's not in NATO, so there's no immediate consequence. What if he did that in Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania? He invades. He says, these aren't Russian troops. Then he says, oh, they are, after they occupy some territory. And then the United States has to decide, do we really want to risk nuclear war to save a little bit of territory in the Baltics, which could require us to trade New York, Washington, Chicago, et cetera, for that little bit of territory? In other words, allowing Putin to get away with this, these salami tactics, is incredibly destabilizing and could lead him to miscalculate Putin that if he takes some NATO territory, he can kill NATO because he'll destroy the credibility of the Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. That would be a miscalculation, and we could stumble into an actual war. Right. So basically what you're saying is that the two sides together, the United States and Europe, are not resolute enough. If they're not resolute enough, I mean, there are cracks that can be exploited, and that undermines the security of both the United States and its European allies. 100%. And to give Europe and the UK credit, they are being resolute. They're the ones who are telling Trump, no, your 28 points are terrible. Got to renegotiate them. It's Washington that is being not resolute. And that's what's so dangerous, because NATO really relies overwhelmingly on U.S. military capabilities and spending for its own military deterrence capability. In terms of the timing of these, because we've reached a crunch stage in the negotiations, these talks taking place in Moscow later on in the week. Is this really the right time to be negotiating this? I mean, given that on the battlefield, Russia has now the upper hand, they've been making, I think they made the biggest advances they've made so far in the war during the month of November. And then, of course, there's this ongoing corruption scandal in Ukraine that's just cost President Zelensky his chief of staff. I mean, would it be better to perhaps hold these talks at a slightly later stage? Yeah, I mean, I understand the point. It would be better if Zelensky had resolved his corruption problem a long time ago, though, and he didn't, and it's real. And it needed to be cleaned up, and it was sapping morale and taking resources away from the battle and putting it into people's pockets. So, yeah, that's a bit of leverage that Putin, through Trump, is going to use on Zelensky. And Trump even mentioned the same thing today on Air Force One. He said, yeah, well, there's, Zelensky's got a lot of pressure on him, a lot of problems, corruption. So Trump is then using the airwaves to squeeze Zelensky. So that part's bad, but it is what it is. The corruption scandal was going to come out at some point. As far as Russian gains on the battlefield are concerned, they're actually quite modest. So during the last year, Russia has it's gained just right around 1% of it, only 1% of additional Ukrainian territory at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dead and injured Russian soldiers. And in fact, Russia now controls way less Ukrainian territory than in the summer of 2022. So, Russia can't keep this going forever either. They've got a lot more troops Putin is willing to sacrifice into the meat grinder. And he's hoping, Putin, that he'll exhaust Ukraine, as well as the United States support and European support. But his economy is really starting to creak also, especially under this latest U.S. sanctions against the big Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Right. So if this team comes back from Moscow empty-handed, as you seem to be suggesting they might do, there is an opportunity here, therefore, for the Trump administration to then tighten the screws, take the sanctions up to the next level, and therefore produce perhaps a deal that's more favorable to Ukraine than one that would be struck this week. What do you think of that logic? 100%. That is exactly the logic I think will work, the only logic that will work. Russia will keep pushing like a knife through butter until it hits, the plate. It has to feel the plate, which means steadfastness on the U.S. side, standing in solidarity with NATO allies and with Ukraine and saying, we will, to paraphrase Mario Draghi, do whatever it takes to make sure Ukraine remains what rightfully Secretary Rubio said Ukraine should be, which is independent, sovereign, and prosperous. Those have to be the strategic objectives, regardless of what Witkoff and Kushner mess up in Moscow. And then the U.S. has to really do something concrete. As you were saying, Tom, crank up the sanctions and make sure Ukraine gets the military support it needs, even while pressing to clean up the corruption, because ultimately Ukraine needs to do that to be stronger as well. I just want to ask you about one other thing while you're here, Matthew. NATO's most senior military officer, a man by the name of Admiral Giuseppe Cavo Dragone, told the Financial Times that NATO was looking at stepping up its response to Russian hybrid warfare. And he said that a preemptive strike could be considered as a defensive action. And this is a comment that's sparked anger in Moscow. They called the comments irresponsible, escalatory,
and an attempt to undermine the peace efforts. What's your interpretation of the significance of what Admiral Dragoni had to say?
Yeah, first of all, the Russian response is propaganda. Russia has a doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. So the Russians are always turning up the pressure to 11, to paraphrase the great movie Spinal Tap, and then they claim somebody else is provoking. So, but what Admiral Dragoni said is unusual, if not unprecedented, for a senior NATO official. But I think it's smart. It's wise. This is the language Russia understands, that we figured out your hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare means Russians are using a myriad of techniques, whether it be meddling in the US elections or the French elections, or cutting cables and pipelines, or using all sorts of psychological warfare, destabilizing political systems. That's all going on. When I said Russia considers itself at war already with us in the West, that's what they're doing. For them, that is war. And so they have to realize that when they're conducting asymmetric warfare, which means they impose much higher costs on their targets, us, than they are experiencing from our countermeasures, they're going to keep doing it. They're going to keep escalating. So they have to know there's a potentially big cost they're going to pay, and that's why they're coming out now with this rhetoric about how this is escalatory and dangerous, because they're worried. They're afraid of what NATO might do. Now, of course, it's easy for me to talk so tough sitting here in my comfortable chair in Istanbul when you carry the responsibility for the NATO alliance and global peace on your shoulders. You have to be prudent. But I think it's really valuable that publicly NATO is starting to talk about much higher costs imposed on Russia, even preemptively, because that means we're saying we know what you're going to do. We have good intelligence, and we're going to hit you before you can do it. That's getting into the Russian psychology, and that needs to happen.
Okay, so quite a different line, therefore, coming from that admiral in NATO from the sorts of things we've been hearing from Washington. Just to bring our conversation to a conclusion, Matthew, we heard President Zelensky talking about bringing the war in Ukraine to what he called a dignified end. What do you think a dignified end would mean? And have you got any inklings as to a time frame here? If we don't think talks in Moscow this week are going to be successful, when might we see some sort of a conclusion?
Yeah, and dignified is a good word, because the overthrow of the predecessor, corrupt president, for a Russian president in Ukraine, was called the Revolution of Dignity. So he's extending that word's use. Well, peace negotiations should not be subject to a false deadline if one party is not negotiating in good faith. And as I said, Russia has not given anything at the table yet. So there's no way, unless there's a appalling conversion on the road to Damascus that Witkoff and Kushner extract from President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov. De facto is going to be them returning empty-handed. They'll have some sort of spin that Russia will provide on the points, but it won't be anything that's acceptable to Ukraine. So when Zelensky says dignified end of the war, another thing to keep in mind is he really wants the war to end. I mean, this is horrible for Ukraine. It's just destroying their country. So nobody wants peace more than Zelensky, but it has to be a dignified peace. It can't be a peace that results in forced regime change by Russia, or Ukraine, as Putin would like, Ukraine no longer existing as a country. This is what Putin wrote about in his famous essay a few years ago, that Ukraine is not a real country and it should be part of Russia. So that would be an undignified peace. But giving up some Ukrainian territory, like we talked about in the beginning of our conversation, some part of Donetsk, or recognizing de facto Russian control over Crimea, or the territory that Russia now occupies in Ukraine, it's possible what Zelensky has in mind is, I'm going to say, okay, I accept that reality. And so he's then communicating back to his voters in Ukraine, we're going to get a dignified peace, but to get the peace, we got to do something that's painful, but we will still retain our dignity with the rest of the settlement. I think that's what he has in mind.
Okay, we really appreciate you sharing that with us. Matthew Breiser, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. Thank you very much for your time.
It was an honor to be with you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.